Footsteps in the abandoned mansion. It was a sunny afternoon, and Emily and her friend Jake decided to take a hike in the nearby forest. They had been hiking for a while when they stumbled upon an old, abandoned mansion. The mansion was hidden behind a dense thicket of trees, and it looked like it had been abandoned for years. "Wow, this looks like it's straight out of a horror movie," Jake said, looking at the mansion in awe. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine as she looked at the mansion. It had an eerie feeling about it, and she could hear strange sounds coming from inside. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, pointing towards the mansion. "It sounds like someone's walking around in there." Jake listened carefully and heard the footsteps too. They were slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth inside the mansion. "Let's go check it out," Jake said, a curious gleam in his eye. Emily wasn't so sure. She had a feeling that they should stay away from the mansion, but Jake was already walking towards it. "Wait up!" Emily called after him, following him towards the mansion. As they approached the mansion, the footsteps grew louder. Emily's heart was pounding in her chest as they pushed open the creaky gate and walked up to the mansion's front door. The door was slightly ajar, and they could see a dim light coming from inside. They hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The mansion was dark and musty, and the air was thick with dust. Emily could feel her skin crawling as she walked through the empty rooms. "Do you think this place is haunted?" Emily whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake shrugged. "Who knows? But let's keep exploring. Maybe we'll find something interesting." As they walked through the mansion, they heard the footsteps again. This time they were closer and louder, and Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, grabbing Jake's arm. Jake nodded, his face pale. "Let's get out of here. I don't like this." But as they turned to leave, they realized that the mansion's doors and windows were all locked. They were trapped inside the mansion with no way out. "We're stuck," Emily said, her voice trembling with fear. Suddenly, they heard the footsteps again, and this time they were coming towards them. They could hear the sound of heavy breathing and the rustling of clothes. Emily and Jake huddled together, too afraid to move as they heard the sound of footsteps and heavy breathing coming towards them. Suddenly, a figure appeared out of the darkness, dressed in a long, flowing gown. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice trembling with fear. The figure didn't answer, but instead beckoned them to follow her. Emily and Jake had no choice but to follow the ghostly figure, who led them through a maze of rooms and corridors until they reached a small study. In the study, they found an old diary lying on a desk. Emily picked it up and began to read. "It belonged to one of the former owners of the mansion," she said, turning to Jake. "It looks like they disappeared without a trace." Jake shuddered. "This place is definitely haunted. We need to get out of here." But Emily was too intrigued by the diary. It contained the history of the mansion and its former owners, a wealthy family who had lived in the mansion over 100 years ago. As Emily read through the diary, she learned about the tragic history of the mansion. The family had a dark secret, and rumors suggested that they had been involved in some sort of illegal activity. "The family disappeared without a trace," Emily said, turning to Jake. "No one knows what happened to them." "That's creepy," Jake said. "Do you think they're still here, haunting the mansion?" Emily shrugged. "It's possible, but there must be a logical explanation for everything." As they continued to explore the mansion, they found clues that suggested the family had been murdered. There were bloodstains on the walls, and furniture was overturned. "This place gives me the creeps," Jake said, looking around nervously. Suddenly, they heard a loud banging sound coming from upstairs. They hesitated for a moment before climbing the stairs to investigate. Upstairs, they found a locked door. Emily tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. "Let's try to find a key," Jake said, looking around. As they searched the rooms, they heard strange sounds coming from inside the locked room. It sounded like someone was crying. "Hello?" Emily called out. "Is anyone there?" But there was no answer. the crying stopped, and the room fell silent. "I don't like this," Jake said, grabbing Emily's arm. "We need to get out of here." But Emily was determined to find out what was behind the locked door. She searched through the rooms until she found an old, rusty key. "Got it!" Emily exclaimed, holding up the key triumphantly. They ran back to the locked door and inserted the key. With a loud creaking sound, the door opened, revealing a dark, musty room. As they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them, and they heard a cold, eerie voice say, "You should have left while you had the chance." Emily and Jake stood frozen in fear as they heard the cold, eerie voice echo through the room. They turned around, but the door was locked, and there was no way out. "What's happening?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jake replied, his eyes darting around the room, "but we need to find a way out of here." As they searched the room, they found an old portrait of the family that had once lived in the mansion. The portrait was eerie, with the family members staring out at them with blank expressions. Suddenly, the portrait came to life, and the family members stepped out of the painting. Emily and Jake watched in horror as the family members moved towards them, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "We have to get out of here!" Emily yelled, grabbing Jake's arm. They ran towards the door, but it wouldn't budge. The family members were getting closer, and Emily and Jake could feel their icy breath on their necks. Just when they thought they were trapped, the ghostly figure that had led them to the study appeared. She held out her hand, and a bright light shone from her palm. The family members recoiled, shielding their eyes from the light. Emily and Jake seized the opportunity to escape and ran towards the door. As they opened the door, they were blinded by the bright sunlight streaming in from the hallway. They stumbled out of the room and collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. "What just happened?" Emily panted, trying to catch her breath. "I don't know," Jake replied, looking around in disbelief. "But I think we just saw a ghost." Emily nodded. "And that ghost just saved our lives." As they sat on the floor, trying to process what had just happened, they heard a loud banging sound coming from upstairs. "We can't stay here," Jake said, standing up. "We need to get out of this mansion before something else happens." Emily nodded in agreement, and they made their way towards the staircase. But as they climbed the stairs, they heard strange whispers and footsteps coming from the shadows. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, grabbing Jake's arm. Jake nodded. "We need to keep moving." As they reached the top of the stairs, they saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was the ghostly figure that had saved them before. "Thank you," Emily said, bowing her head respectfully. The ghostly figure simply nodded before disappearing into the darkness. Emily and Jake continued down the hallway, their hearts racing with fear. They knew they had to find a way out of the mansion before it was too late. Emily and Jake cautiously made their way down the hallway, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The banging sound they had heard earlier seemed to be coming from a room at the end of the hall. "Should we check it out?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Jake replied, his eyes darting nervously around the hallway. "But we can't stay here forever." They slowly approached the door at the end of the hallway, which was slightly ajar. As they peeked inside, they saw a small, dimly lit room with an old wooden desk in the corner. "What's that?" Emily whispered, pointing towards a small box on the desk. Jake stepped closer and picked up the box. It was old and worn, with intricate carvings on the lid. He tried to open it, but it was locked. "We need to find a key," Jake said, putting the box down on the desk. As they searched the room, they noticed that the walls were covered in old photographs and newspaper clippings. One of the photos caught Emily's eye, and she picked it up to take a closer look. It was a photo of the same family they had seen in the portrait downstairs, but this time, they were all gathered around a small girl who looked to be about 5 years old. "Who's this?" Emily asked, showing the photo to Jake. "I don't know," Jake replied, studying the photo closely. but I have a feeling she might be important." Just then, they heard a faint clicking sound coming from the desk. They turned around to see that the box had unlocked itself and the lid was slowly opening. As they approached the desk, they saw an old, leather-bound journal inside the box. "This must be the key to the mystery," Emily said, picking up the journal. As they read through the journal, they discovered that the little girl in the photograph was the daughter of the family who had once lived in the mansion. She had gone missing one night, and her family had searched the entire house for her, but she was nowhere to be found. The family had eventually moved away, and the mansion had remained empty ever since. But the journal revealed that the little girl had been trapped in the mansion all along, unable to escape the clutches of a vengeful ghost who had taken her life. "We have to find her," Emily said, determined to uncover the truth. They searched the room for any clues that could lead them to the little girl, and finally, they discovered a hidden passage behind one of the bookshelves. As they made their way through the passage, they heard a faint crying sound coming from up ahead. "That must be her," Jake said, leading the way. They emerged from the passage into a small room, where they saw the ghostly figure standing over a small girl who was crying on the floor. "Please help me," the little girl said, looking up at them with tear-filled eyes. Emily and Jake approached the ghostly figure, who turned to face them. "Please let her go," Emily pleaded. "She doesn't deserve to be trapped here forever." The ghostly figure looked at them for a moment before disappearing into thin air, releasing the little girl from her captivity. Emily and Jake helped the little girl to her feet and led her towards the exit of the mansion. As they stepped outside into the bright sunlight, they breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that they had uncovered the truth about the mansion's dark past. But as they looked back at the mansion, they saw the ghostly figure standing in the window, watching them with a sad, longing expression. "Rest in peace," Emily whispered. As they left the mansion, Emily, Jake, and the little girl walked towards their car, exhausted from their ordeal. "That was insane," Jake said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I know," Emily replied, still trying to process everything that had happened. "But at least we were able to help that little girl." The little girl looked up at them, a small smile on her face. "Thank you for saving me," she said softly. As they drove away from the mansion, Emily and Jake discussed what they had learned. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," Emily said, determined to make a difference. "But how?" Jake asked, unsure of what they could do. "We can start by spreading the word," Emily replied. "We can tell people about the dangers of exploring abandoned buildings and the importance of respecting the dead." Jake nodded in agreement, and they both knew that they had a long road ahead of them. As they drove into town, they stopped at the local police station to report what they had found. The police officers listened intently as they told their story, and when they were finished, the officers promised to investigate the mansion and try to find any evidence that could help them solve the case. Emily and Jake left the police station feeling relieved, knowing that they had done the right thing. Over the next few weeks, Emily and Jake worked tirelessly to spread the word about their experience. They talked to anyone who would listen, warning them of the dangers of exploring abandoned buildings and urging them to respect the dead. Their efforts did not go unnoticed, and soon, people from all over the country were reaching out to them, sharing their own stories and asking for their help. Emily and Jake knew that they had made a difference, and they continued to work towards their goal of preventing more tragedies like the one they had witnessed. Years later, when they looked back on their experience, they knew that it had changed them forever. They had faced their fears and uncovered the truth about a dark and tragic past. But most importantly, they had saved a little girl from a fate worse than death, and that was something that they would never forget.